The GTA Remastered Trilogy was not Grovestreet Games' first rodeo. In fact, Rockstar had worked with them for a number of releases, GTA 3, Vice City, San Andreas and Bully on mobile, so in many ways they were the obvious choice for working on the Remastered Trilogy. I think though perhaps their ambition outweighed their skill, and we all know how that one turned out. And sometimes the perfect moniker for a remaster is if it's not broke, don't fix it. With that in mind, Rockstar have taken the reins back from Grovestreet, with the Florida-based team almost entirely stripped from this production. Now with Rockstar fully at the helm, we see a numerous number of changes, significant improvements in the engine, more bug fixes than you can shake a stick at, as well as entirely new control options. And on Switch, well, we get a lot of this, but we also have a slightly different picture in other areas. I didn't think I'd be semi-re-reviewing the game 3 years later, but here we are. If you enjoy this style of content, let me know down below. Tickle all the buttons. Now, what are the biggest changes? Well, my name's Mark Walker. Welcome back to SwitchUp. Now let's find out. Let's play a little game. Can you spot the difference? Yet Rockstar have added in a classic lighting mode. Despite the name though, this does far more than change the lighting. Across all three games, it makes huge differences. It changes the way that colors are handled. The lighting engine that was added using the Unreal Engine in many ways actually remains the same. Things like real-time reflections on the roof of cars remain, but it's like a filter shift across those titles. And then there are other elements as well. The way that weather is handled has changed. It's now much more convincing, and also weather effects are more in line with what you would expect, even down to clouds being accurately rendered when you switch to the classic lighting mode and entirely disappearing when you jump back to what Grovestreet did. It does feel a little bit savage that they've left it in, but I can understand why it's there. There might be some people that prefer the original lighting, but I did also notice that they've left in some of the mistakes that Grovestreet made. Sometimes shadows wouldn't render accurately under the car and would be offset. They've kept that in some places, and then you switch back to their classic lighting and obviously that shadow might have disappeared or it might be moved to where it should be, but it's an example of the extensive work they've done. Now when you're flying around the city, the re-inclusion of proper fog makes a big difference to the feel and scale of the world. This is never more evident than when you're flying over the city or the desert. It's funny, isn't it? Because you can imagine Grovestreet thinking, yeah, this looks amazing, we can see everything, but then something's lost in translation. It's a little bit like the graphics equivalent of when you take a 24 frames per second scene and then render it as 60 frames per second, like they've done with many of these modern TVs by introducing frames to smooth out visuals to 60. And what it actually does is make things look really cheap. The same can be said here. By giving the player too much visual information, you shrink the size and feel of the world, but you also remove any artistic direction. It becomes a generic Unreal Engine game. The classic mode does away with that, even down to areas that feel almost claustrophobic with the level of that mist and fog, but actually it's a game, it's a piece of art, and it needs that original artistic direction. When you move over to something like Vice City, having the Grovestreet visuals, it doesn't feel like Vice City at all. And actually when I was playing it back, 3 years ago, I didn't mind the changes and thought, yeah, this is okay. It's not till you actually play the original intent that that feeling hits you of, oh, okay, so that's Vice City, I remember now. The volumetric fog that I was talking about in San Andreas really does make a difference to that feeling. Things like the distant bridges being foggy and actually flying through clouds, it's very good. They've also included a toggle for low-level mist by the ground, which you can switch on and off. When we look at handheld modes as well, we can see that these improvements carry over. In many ways, handheld has always been my preferred way to play this series on Switch, and that remains consistent now with these changes. All of them can be applied in handheld, and it isn't just fog that can be toggled on and off. In terms of ground fog, you can also change the bloom effect. If bloom's not something you like, it feels a bit overblown, you can turn that off. But the classic lighting will also change the way that nighttime's handled. Rather than the lifeless black sheet that we were presented with the original remaster release, we've once again got the artistic purples that we had back in the day. There are also times where you'll be able to see the stars where you previously couldn't, so that's easily the biggest change. Now you might be wondering how these changes affect performance. The Nintendo Switch has been notorious for having by far the worst performance across all platforms, and sadly that isn't something that's been particularly improved. Generally the games can maintain 30, however it does stutter down. My biggest issue with the Remastered Trilogy were the number of stutters. The Unreal Engine 4 on Switch just is not a great option, and that remains the case here. I experienced a number of frame pacing issues, stutters, and while you could class it certainly as playable, and I think it feels a bit smoother in handheld, I don't remember the frame hitching being quite as bad. I had it hang for about 2 or 3 seconds at one point. It must have been this bad, but because it was so terrible right at the beginning, over the years it just felt more and more playable. Still, it's a shame that Rockstar couldn't get this completely locked out at 30 fluid with decent frame pacing. It is nice then to know that it's going to be playable on Switch too, and I don't think it would take a lot of hardware for them to be able to run this at 60. Now, aside from the lighting, we've got things like the character models being rigged better. When I say rigged, before we had some strange things, like when CJ was crouching down, he had this huge hunchback. That now looks the way that it should. And the same goes for a few other animations, like when he was riding his bike, which I don't have a photo of, but I'll just yoink that from Twitter over at Synth Potato's Twitter account. Go check him out. He's done a really good job of putting together another list that has some things that I haven't covered. One other note on visuals are the parallax interiors being removed. This was an addition that Grovestreet made. I think they thought would look good, where you could see into some interiors with kind of a 3D effect that would scroll as you moved. Not only did it cause huge issues on Switch with performance, which is not the end of the world, but it was another contributing factor. A lot of people just didn't like them, so they have removed those across all versions of the game. The shadows were fixed in a previous version by Grovestreet, but with the new lighting they look even better. It also strips out some of the shadows where they're unnecessary. You'll now also find the time and date on load screens and save screens, so it will actually show you when it was recorded. They've changed the color of tire smoke on some of the vehicles. I think it was black in the remaster originally, and now it actually looks correct. And across all 3 games they've added a gradient effect in the distance for oceans. On the subject of the reflections, I think they might have actually switched the way that these work, now opting for a cube map reflection over Unreal Engine's SSR. And although those shadows were previously fixed, they have also altered the way that those are implemented to fix an issue where environmental shadows moved in chunks in all 3 titles. They're now very smooth as they move around. Now, I did notice there are still some geometry issues, splits in the world and such, but again, not as bad as it was. In the next section, we'll go game by game and tell you the changes, or at least the most pertinent ones that I think people want to know about when it comes to slight gameplay tweaks and fixes in that regard. But before we do that, I want to talk about the control changes, because this is massive. Rockstar have entirely changed the way that you control when shooting. So if you've got certain weapons out, you can now run and gun. You can aim on the Switch using the gyroscopic control, then with the left stick you can strafe around. It makes for a much more precise experience. Previously I had to have auto targeting on just so that I could aim because you were locked into place. Now you can strafe yourself into position as you would with a more modern shooter. This applies to things like the shotguns, assault rifles and flamethrowers. And when it comes to the signage in the game, so all the signs in the game should now be accurate. If you're in cutscenes you can pause the game now, and the fire and smoke effects when things set on fire and explode have been improved. On Switch, I can't remember if the glass used to shatter or just disappear entirely or nothing happened. Now on Switch you just get a little bit of a change of texture. It still doesn't look great. So a couple of gameplay changes as well. You've got things like Claude's middle finger being reinstated, so he could basically flip the bird to someone if they're in their car. They've put that back in. His head will bob when bumping into pedestrians. If you head into the gym and go to the punch bags, these were locked in place because Grovestreet hadn't done the basically the physics for them. Now they swing around as you hit them. They look the way they should. They fixed a number of sound loops as well and glitches, and they've redrawn some of the maps to now include features such as rocks within the sea, not necessarily places you can visit, but just to make them more accurate. And some textures that were glitched out in front of the airport have been fixed as well. The roads now look like roads. as well as tweaking the way that rain looks once again so that it looks better than if you remember the initial release, which was just complete garbage. They've tweaked things like vehicle suspension as well, at least the height of it, as well as tweaking the lamp colours, so at night times the street lights and lamps look much more like they did originally, but still benefiting from lighting improvements. And they tweaked the way that the swim animations sync with the wave movements, just so that the swimming looks a lot less janky, as well as a number of collision issues when moving around the world. Cutscene lighting has been improved, as have the textures on a load of buildings, things like doors and windows. Oh, and most important, of course, they've fixed the colours of the world's biggest sorry, I'll leave your brain to fill in that one. Now, I'm sure there are bits and bobs that I've missed, but these are the most pertinent ones to me. I will link to creators that I've used. The community are amazing. So many people have been looking for these things, so do go check out their content as well, and I do hope this was of some use to you. If it was, let me know down in the comments, hit that like button, all that silly stuff. And as always, a thanks to all of you who enjoy the channel and our Patreons and members. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya! Oh, I need to patch my see ya. Cheers, guys. See ya!